Great. Great. Good morning, Byddwn. Welcome, croeso, everybody. It's really great to be here today to talk about the role of land in providing housing in Wales. Today's session is called Taking Back Control, Community Land. And my name is Oriel Miller. I'm the director of the Institute of Welsh Affairs, the IWA. It's community-owned land and assets, in fact, the full title. Land, obviously, is one of our most finite and precious resources. It's the literal foundation of our society, being essential to our most basic needs, such as food and shelter. And as the very famous Mark Twain quote goes, they aren't making it anymore. As the foundation of so much of our society, then, how we organise land makes a huge contribution to how we organise our society, what we choose to use it for, who has access to it, who owns it, and who is allowed to use it, are vitally important questions for policymakers. And yet, in Wales, we rarely hear about land being spoken of in this really strategic sense. In Wales, we use nearly 90% of our land for agriculture, which contributes to less than 1% of Wales's GVA. And about 80% of Wales's land is classed as a less favourable area for agriculture. This contrasts, for example, to only 16%, so 80% to 16% of England's land being classed in a similar way. So if we were to be very hard-headed indeed, and in massive square, big scare quotes, economically rational about it, we would conclude that agriculture is a bad use of Welsh land. For those of you listening, I'm doing scare quotes around those terms. But of course, such simplistic readings rarely capture everything that matters, because we know that agriculture is the heart and soul of many rural communities, including providing the economic basis for rural Welsh language communities. And it also has a clear role to play in the Welsh food and drink industry, which is booming and surpassing the ambitious targets set for it. But at the same time, we're facing a housing crisis. We live in a society that's come to see housing as a commodity. For some, empty potential homes are treated as part of an investment portfolio. For others, the ever-increasing value of their home can provide security all the way to old age. And of course, many people hope to pass that asset on to the next generation. For others, owning a house is something they help their landlord to do, but they can't ever hope to do for themselves. As our society has come to view home ownership as an economic necessity, demand has risen at the same time as supply has become constrained. Because of this, we're now facing housing costs increasing at a rate far higher than wages, with housing becoming increasingly unaffordable, especially for those who don't have the family wealth, provide a deposit and keep their credit in good shape in early life to get them on the property ladder. Instead, the private rented sector, the PRS, has become a way of life for most young people, contributing to generational inequality while also seeing rising rents. Increasing supply is a clear necessity to solving the housing crisis. And one of the key bottlenecks when seeking to increase housing supply is the availability of suitable land. And I know this came up in some of the conversations people were at yesterday. That's just one of the reasons why the IWA wants to start a conversation about how we can strategically use Wales's land and what Wales's priorities are for it. How do we utilise our land to best support local rural communities while also providing land for housing, renewable energy generation, and more? For the IWA, that's a really key question. We want to see a successful, clean, green, and fair economy for Wales. It's really great to be joined by Lindsay Chalmers from Scotland. Scotland's passed multiple pieces of legislation in this area and has various organisations such as the Scottish Land Commission, who are responsible for making more of Scotland's land by stimulating fresh thinking, supporting change on the ground, and making recommendations to Scottish ministers. At the IWA, over the last few months, we've been researching land policy, and we've been talking to landowners, managers, and community groups in Wales in order to examine how communities might have more of a say over land in their area. And we'll be publishing an initial piece of work on this in December after some round tables. We think it's time to start having a conversation about how communities can benefit from their land in Wales. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion being a part of that. We've all got a lot to learn. I'm going to introduce our speakers first. We're going to have 2 speakers and then a good chunk of time for Q&A at the end. If you have got a question, please mark it in the chat, but it is a question and we'll make sure that I can feed it through. It's sometimes tricky to keep track of everything that's going on in the chat bar and really listen to what's going on in the conversation. So joining us today, and the window cleaner has just arrived in the office, so apologies for the noises off if you can hear it, that's what it is Lindsay Chalmers, who's Development Manager for Community Land Scotland. And her role is to promote and encourage the take-up of community land ownership across Scotland and support peer-to-peer learning and networking among community landowners. Community Land Scotland was established in 2010 as a response to the need for a collective voice for community landowners. Their vision is for the community ownership of land and buildings to be a significant driver of sustainable development across the whole of Scotland. Lindsay previously worked for the Edinburgh Social Enterprise Network, where she developed the Buy the Good Stuff social enterprise brand and ran Scotland's first social enterprise festival. And prior to that, she spent a long time working for the Community Resources Network in Scotland, supporting community reuse organisations across the country. So welcome, Lindsay. We've also got Casey Edwards, who's the community-led housing advisor for the Wales Cooperative Centre. She joined the team in 2017, working as the Communities Creating Homes programme, and she works with communities and organisations to establish community-led housing projects across Wales. So they aim to do this through promotion, support and advice, networking and policy development. Casey's worked in the third sector since graduating from Cardiff with an MSc in Sustainability, Planning and Environmental Policy in 2014. And she began her career with a CIC, a community interest company, working on a community asset transfer. Then moved to join one of Wales's largest registered social landlords, working on community development projects. So we've got oodles of experience coming your way from both Lindsay and Casey. So Lindsay, we're going to come to you first, and we've got about 15-20 minutes or so to hear what things look like where you are.
Thank you. I'm joining from Scotland, and I've got the noise of a search and rescue helicopter outside just to...
Oh, great! We can't hear it, you're all right.
So hopefully you can all see my presentation. So I'm going to give you a kind of overview of where we are in Scotland at the moment when it comes to land reform and community rights around buying land and assets. I'm going to take you through a little bit of history so you can understand how we got to the point where we are now. But one thing that's probably important to share early on is that we've got quite a specific model for community ownership in Scotland. It's geographically based communities with open membership to anyone living in that community. So we've got, in the early days of community ownership, we had a variety of models, but over the years, that model has kind of become the standard one that all of the legislation and funding is based on. And our communities own a huge range of assets, everything from MOD bases with submarine docking stations through to high street buildings. But housing is still a really important part of what many of our communities do, and particularly in rural areas where the driver for community ownership is often reversing depopulation. So to give you some background why land reform is so important in Scotland, land ownership is very dominated by a small number of people. Scotland has the most unequal land ownership anywhere in the developed world. And this is something people were very aware of for a long time. So in the run up to the Scottish Parliament in 1999, a lot of preparatory work was done so the Scottish Parliament could get moving on this issue as soon as possible. So we saw our first Land Reform Act in 2003. And since then we've had a suite of legislation and funding and policy programmes that have supported community ownership. So at the same time, all the discussions were going on in the run up to Scottish Parliament being set up, we were starting to see this wave of modern buyouts in Scotland where communities at that time really who felt they had no choice but to try and buy their land were raising funds to try and purchase the land where they lived. And this is often down to kind of poor management, poor ownership of estates that they lived on. So one of the first ones was the Isle of Egg in 1997. The community there had a series of landowners. The houses were in very poor state. They had rat infestations. The island only had 2 hours of electricity a day. So, and we often get journalists asking us if people on Egg can talk about how they felt being on television all over the world at the time of the buyout, but nobody on Egg can talk about that because there's so little electricity that most of them didn't have televisions. And since the buyout happened, our island is now 100% powered by renewables. The population has increased, it's almost doubled, and they've had a programme of upgrading all of their housing and also creating new housing for people who are moving onto the island. So although those early community landowners were driven to react really to bad situations, they inspired lots of other communities, and I think they really impressed government and lots of other organisations with what communities were able to do. But Isle of Egg only had just over 60 people living on the island at the time, so what they've been able to achieve is quite spectacular. So we've seen since 2003 kind of wave of legislation, but the first one was the community right to buy. It's still the most commonly used legislation. It was introduced in the Land Reform Act of 2003, and all of the legislation around community right to buy seeks to balance the property rights of landowners with the human rights of communities. So for a long time in Scotland, all that had really been talked about was the property rights of landowners, which at the time they were very fiercely defending. But the argument on the other side was that communities have rights as well. And so all of the legislation seeks to balance those two things. The first community right to buy was only for rural communities. It's a preemptive right, so it only comes into force when the landowner gets to the point of sale. So it can't force a sale of land, it effectively just freezes ownership, it stops the landowner selling to anyone else. And when they come to the point of selling, the community has effectively kind of got first dibs on the land. The community needs to have a compliant body, so there are requirements around what the organisation looks like. So for example, there needs to be a requirement in the governing documents that at least 75% of members of the body are from that geographic area. Initially, it was only open to companies limited by guarantee, but that's since expanded to Scottish charitable incorporated organisations and community benefit societies as well. Communities need to show that what they're doing is in the public interest, so it can't be used to block development, and also that it's in the sustainable development of the community. So they mean that very broadly in terms of social, economic and environmental sustainable development of the community. It's quite a complex process. It starts at the beginning with a petition list, so a community has to get signatures of at least 10% of people on the electoral register in their community. If communities are going through a late application, which is possible in certain circumstances, if the landowner has already taken steps to sell the land, it becomes what's called a late application, and then they have to get around 16% of signatures of people living in the community. And then at the end of the process, when the landowner triggers the sale, the community needs to carry out a ballot. So they need to get roughly 50% of people voting yes to the buyout and 50% of the community voting. But if they get, for example, 40% of people voting and 95% of those people say yes, the government will allow that to pass because democratically they've got approval for the buyout. And then land and building is valued by a district valuer. So that's to kind of reduce the arguing really between the community and the private landowner of the value of the land. The Scottish Government arranged to have the land valued, and it's really up to the landowner if they want to sit on the land and not sell it, or if they want to sell it for the value that the district valuer has put on it. So sometimes landowners will, be disappointed by the value and they'll decide to effectively take the land off the market and just hold on to it. And sometimes they will decide that they just want to continue and they will go on and sell the land to the community. So as I said, we've had a whole range of different legislation over the last 20 years, and that's meant that there's been a consistent growth of community ownership in Scotland. In 2001, it was originally the lottery brought out a Scottish land fund, and that was to allow communities that needed to raise funds to purchase assets and to get funding. And then since then, the Scottish Government has taken over the Scottish Land Fund. It went up to £10 million a year in 2016, and they've committed to it going up to £20 million a year by the end of this parliamentary term, mostly because we're getting interest in community ownership from right across Scotland. Now, it started out as something that was really a Highlands and Islands thing, but now we're seeing much more of it in urban areas in the south of Scotland as well. So the demand on the Scottish Land Fund has been growing quite rapidly. In 2016, we had the Community Empowerment Act and Land Reform Act, which brought in further rights, which we'll go into in a minute. And we've got to the point now where we've got over 400 community organisations in Scotland owning 612 assets between them. So it's just, you know, it's one of the things where we're just seeing kind of consistent and continued growth of communities owning assets. So we now have a number of different options. So if a community comes to us and they're at the early stages of thinking about buying land or buildings, we would run them through this kind of range of options that they have now. So still the most common is by negotiation. So the community right to buy is only used in a narrow range of circumstances. But what we would say is that most of the other negotiated purchases happen in the shadow of the law. They wouldn't have happened if the community right to buy had come in and changed the whole discussion about community ownership. So we've found, you know, over the last 20 years that landowners now are much more open to talking to communities about selling them land, because most landowners don't want to find themselves in the middle of a community right to buy process. There are a couple of landowners who love community right to buy, such as the Church of Scotland, and require communities to go through community right to buy, even when it's a negotiated sale, because that ticks a lot of their boxes in terms of compliance and making sure communities are doing everything properly. And so there are some landowners that do actually require it, even when they're open to selling to a community. So in 2016, the community right to buy was extended to urban areas, and we've seen a few buyouts in cities and towns since then using community right to buy. There's also now a range of effectively compulsory purchase community right to buy, where communities can force the sale of land. The first of those is the Crofting community right to buy, which came back way back in the first Land Reform Act. We've got Crofting is a specific type of Scottish legislation. It only exists in 5 local authority areas in Scotland, but it gives people who own what's effectively small holdings lots of rights over their land, and they have an absolute right to buy. But there's never been a case where they've used that all the way through, because every time the community has tried to do that, it's ended up in a negotiated sale. Then we saw a community right to buy abandoned, neglected and detrimental land. So this is where communities have got land ownership in their community which is negative. It's doing something bad for the community. It could be a building or a hotel or something like that's been abandoned. It could be land that's causing flooding through mismanagement. So that legislation was brought in to allow communities to force a sale of land where they've got land ownership causing something negative. That legislation, we would say, got slightly mangled in its later stages. So the Scottish Government have agreed to reviewing that 5 years after its introduction, because it's never actually been used yet. And then last year, we had this new right to buy to further sustainable development coming in, which we think is quite an exciting right to buy. And that's where a community wants to do something positive for its community. So it could be that they've got a real shortage of affordable housing. It could be that they need to develop business space because there's nowhere for businesses to operate from. So that allows the communities to come forward and say, our community needs this land or building, and without that land or building, we can't progress our community, and it's having a detrimental effect on the community. So we've got some communities that are going through that and are still at early stages at the moment. And the other interesting thing about that legislation is that the communities can nominate a third party to purchase the land or buildings on their behalf. So we think the original thinking around that was to allow communities that maybe had shortage of affordable housing, for example, that didn't want to develop the housing themselves, could nominate a housing association to take on the land and build housing on it. But no one has tried that yet, so we're waiting to see how that's actually going to play out in practice. But that makes it quite different to the other rights, which only allow communities to own the land itself. And then we also have asset transfer legislation in Scotland, which came in the Community Empowerment Act. So that gives communities, both communities of interest and communities of geography in that case, the right to request the ownership or lease of assets that are owned by devolved public bodies in Scotland, local authorities, NHS, Police Scotland, and those type of bodies. And I think that one is probably going to be reviewed as well, because it's been very successful in some cases, but I think there's kind of general agreement that it needs a little bit of work to make it more usable. And then behind all of the legislation, we've got the things that also have a really big impact on the ability of communities to buy land. So the Scottish Government is very supportive of land reform, and pretty much every political party in Scotland is supportive of community ownership as well, which does, create a really positive environment for new policies and legislation to come in. So as I mentioned, we've got the Scottish Land Fund. Ariel mentioned we have the Scottish Land Commission, which was set up a few years ago to drive forward land reform. So it's a government-owned body that does a lot of research, looking at things around public interest tests, for example, land value tax, how to break up monopoly land ownership, where you've got one owner owning huge amounts of land and the communities living in that land can't develop anything like housing because they can't get access to any land. So all of these things about how to kind of break up land ownership and just make it less of an appealing thing for people to own. That's all been driven by the Scottish Land Commission, and they're looking at another land reform bill in this term. So we're hoping within that they're going to simplify community right to buy a bit, which is not a straightforward thing because it's that balance of property rights and human rights has to be looked at quite closely. But the government is also talking about bringing in public interest tests. So in Scotland, we're seeing a huge amount of land being sold at the moment for carbon credits and rewilding. And the Scottish Government is a bit concerned about that. So they're looking at bringing in a test so that when strategic assets such as large estates come up for sale, there'll be a test on them to make sure that that sale is in the wider public interest. And in certain circumstances, they're also looking at breaking up existing estates, for example, where the landowner is not operating in the interests of the people who live there. So that is very much live at the moment, where the government is doing a lot of research and taking a lot of legal advice about how they can make that work in practice. We also have a rural housing fund in Scotland, which has funded the development of hundreds of houses, mostly in kind of island and very rural communities. They have also made a commitment to pilot urban housing in Scotland. Community ownership is now part of the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. So every year they measure how many communities own land, what assets they own, which local authorities are doing better, because it's still very dominated by the Highlands and Islands in terms of numbers. We also have Land Rights and Responsibility Statement, which is the first in the world. So this Land Rights and Responsibility Statement sets out the responsibilities of landowners as well as their rights. And there's a suite of protocols that sit behind that set out how landowners are expected to behave in Scotland. And that's something else the government is looking at, and should that become a statutory responsibility. So for example, if a landowner bought an estate and they decided they were going to empty all the tenants out of the houses, possibly they could step in at that point and stop that kind of thing happening, because they would say the landowner is not acting in a responsible way. We also have holiday let legislation coming in, because I'm sure you've got the same problem in Wales, where a lot of areas that are popular with tourists, a lot of the houses have been turned into Airbnbs. And so the government is bringing in legislation to try and control that a bit more. And then recently we had a commitment to repopulation and planning policy. So even when our communities manage to buy land, sometimes they get stuck in the planning system because they're often trying to build housing in areas that are very rural, where there's a clear housing need in their eyes, but possibly not when it comes to proving housing need in a more traditional way. So we've been campaigning to make it easier for our communities to repopulate and create more housing for young people particularly. So that is something that has now come into policy. So a lot of the work that we do, community land ownership, is also around culture change. So we do a lot of work kind of raising awareness of how fantastic community ownership is, because if we're to see policy changing in Scotland, we need buy-in from the general public. So a lot of our work is about kind of celebrating what communities have been able to do with community ownership. So when I was talking to Casey last week, we're in the middle of Community Land Week, which is our annual festival we run with the Scottish Government that celebrates what communities have achieved in terms of community ownership. So the picture here is of a community up in Skye, which ran kind of campfire marshmallows event on Saturday, which I was lucky enough to go to, and we got a lot of those stories in the media last week. So we would say that all the work that we do around policy is really important, but all the work we do around awareness raising, culture change has been just as important, particularly work we do with private landowners to try and win their hearts in terms of selling land and buildings to communities. And between the work that we do in the Scottish Land Commission and various other bodies, we're starting to see private landowners becoming much more open to selling land and buildings to communities. So I thought I'd just touch on some of the communities that have used community right to buy to develop housing. There's Caboki Community Trust, which is a commuter village in Inverness, and they've had loads of private housing built there, but very little in the way of community facilities. So the trust there has bought an area of land where they're creating a new village green in the middle of the community, and they're planning to build affordable housing on that land as well, because the village had just become really, it was housing, more housing without any kind of facilities. So the community has stepped in there to try and make it more of a place that's got a kind of living, breathing heart to it. There's Wigtown and Bladnoch Community Initiative down in the south, which bought former bank building, is turning that into affordable housing and a bunkhouse. And then a few years ago, the Isle of Ulva went through the late community right to buy process to buy the whole island, which is a small island off of the island of Mull. And the population on that island had dropped from 800 to 5 over the years. And so when the community purchased that, they felt like their #1 priority had to be repopulating the island. So they inherited a very small number of livable houses, but a lot of kind of houses in a state of semi-collapse. So they've got a long-term plan to get the population there back up to 100 people. And when they did the initial kind of call out to see who was interested in moving there, everyone said, oh, no one's going to want to move to Ulva. But they had 350 registrations of interest, so people who wanted to move to Ulva. So their problem is now holding people back who want to live there, so they can get the time to actually bring all the houses back into use and start developing new houses as well. So that is my quick run through of everything community land related in Scotland.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Val. It's really fascinating and loads of questions I want to ask you straight away. I'm going to hold back until we've heard from Casey, but you get top marks for sticking brilliantly to time. So thank you very much, making my job very easy. Casey, we've heard a lot about community empowerment in Scotland. Can you tell us what the lie of the land is, pun entirely intended, in Wales, please, in terms of community ownership?
Of course I can. Bear with me 1 second while I share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see that and not my presenter view.
All good, Casey. Yeah. No, that was fine. We could see fine.
I lost you all then. Bear with me 1 second. Let me do that again. Fantastic. So thank you very much for the introduction, Oriel, and thank you, Lindsay, for that great overview of community land ownership and rights in Scotland. I think we all looked at Scotland with lots of jealousy for all of your really progressive legislation in terms of land and community assets. So like Oriel said, I'm Casey Edwards. I'm a community-led housing advisor with the Communities Creating Homes programme at the Wales Cooperative Centre. So we are a 3-year funded programme by the Welsh Government and Nationwide Foundation to develop a thriving community-led housing movement in Wales. And like I said, we are part of the Wales Cooperative Centre. And for those of you that aren't aware of the Wales Cooperative Centre, we are the voice for the social economy and inclusion in Wales. So since 1982, it's our 40th birthday next year, we've been working to create a better, fairer, more cooperative Wales. Within the centre, there are various different projects and programmes that we hopefully can help Wales be a more cooperative and fairer economy. So like I said, I'm part of the Communities Creating Homes programme there. So we're talking about land and community rights today, and I sort of must start this presentation with the caveat that I am no expert on land, but I think it really relates to the work that we do on community-led housing. And I just wanted to start with this quote that for me, land must be owned by the community, and the community, not capitalist, must democratically decide how the land is used. So I think the sort of agenda around land and community rights in Wales could be multiple people's full-time job, But I think what we really wanted to do is to reignite the conversation on community power and community ownership of land and assets in Wales. And I think, you know, Oriel summed it up perfectly in the introduction, that the housing crisis is really driven by our broken land market. I'm sure that I don't need to tell anybody here today about the housing crisis and the increasing rents that people are facing, the evictions and insecure tenancies, how home ownership is unattainable for many, especially in rural communities, because of the increase of second homes and the sort of rise in remote working. There's a definite over-reliance on the private rented sector in Wales, and then that obviously comes with poor conditions and overcrowding, and obviously there are many empty homes in Wales that we also need to tackle. So for me, the housing crisis is directly linked to the land market, I suppose, and property value is driven by the cost of the build, but also the cost of the land that the structure is built upon. And generally the cost of the land is the largest of the price. So obviously the homes increase in cost. And obviously lots of public land in Wales has been sold to private developers over the years, which is also causing problems. And obviously just some really depressing sort of quotes here, that 90% of all millionaires become rich through real estate, and landlords grow rich in their sleep. And, you know, there are several articles out there about sort of increasing your rural land value and encouraging land owners to take advantage of the market without losing long-term value. So for landowners, I suppose owning land is the best way of storing value, and landowners often keep land in short supply, but the value of land often goes up over time, even if landowners do nothing to improve it. So for us, I think, and for people in Wales, people feel that landowners have too much power over what gets built in their own communities, so the communities don't have any control or say in what gets built. So we feel that community-led housing can play a role in removing land from the speculative market. So for those of you that aren't aware, community-led housing is about local people taking a leading and lasting role in creating secure, affordable housing and strengthening their communities. So there's a big movement across the UK to raise the profile of community-led housing and get more people to develop community-led housing. It can come in all shapes and sizes. It's about developing new housing, retrofitting existing properties, and also people taking over existing homes as well to make them more democratic. And like I said, we are part of a UK movement for community-led housing, and we are the Wales hub that offers support and advice. And I think, like Lindsay was saying, we don't just offer that support and advice to community groups, but we also do a lot of raising awareness and policy development to try and really grow this movement. Oh, I've gone back one there. So the key principles of community-led housing, for those of you that aren't aware, the development and creation of housing has to be led by the community. The community have to own, manage or steward their homes in the long term. The development of community-led housing results in collective benefit, so it's not sort of lining the pockets of big property developers, and the housing has to be affordable. So it could be anything from friends joining together and buying a shared house, leaseholders coming together to jointly managing their homes, local people actually developing new affordable housing, converting empty properties, social tenants taking on housing management, social enterprises developing the homes. I suppose the list really is endless in terms of what the options are, but for us these four key principles are what really makes community-led housing. And I think there are several different forms of community-led housing, but they can really help in removing that land from the speculative market. And this slide really just sums up the benefits of community-led housing. So it is for everyone, built with people in mind, for everyday life, the environment and a more sustainable future. They create homes that are generally affordable to rent and buy, and that means that community aren't displaced, young people have security, and then obviously that results in sort of local resources and services remaining open, like schools and shops. And because prices are protected in perpetuity, obviously future generations will benefit from these community-led housing too. And so homes are designed by local people, and they are built with local people in mind, not for profit, sorry. So they're high quality and truly consider what people really need to live happily and independently. And there are so many benefits of community-led housing. It obviously diversifies the housing market. We've relied on one form of housing development for too long. It gives residents a stronger voice. It empowers local communities. It can encourage regeneration and bringing empty properties back into use. But what we've also found, we did a couple of pieces of research over the last couple of years around sort of the softer benefits of community-led housing. It's not just about providing an affordable roof over people's heads, but it's also about the well-being benefits that they get from being part of community-led housing. So we found that it can reduce social isolation, it can increase confidence, people learn new skills along the way, and obviously there are then wider benefits to that community as well. So it's important that people have an affordable roof over the head, but there are so many more benefits to community-led housing. And you might be thinking, well, why are we sort of talking about land reform and community ownership? But for us, it's one of the key barriers that our community-led housing groups face while they're developing these community-led homes. So we're currently working with about 60 projects across Wales that are aiming to deliver over 500 affordable homes. And like I said, the main barriers that those groups face is the fact that they find it very difficult to find land and then to actually acquire the land as well. So we feel that community-led housing can be a way of protecting land that's more affordable. That means that the homes are then affordable for future generations. And like I said, there are many different ways of doing this. So I think community land trusts are the most sort of well-known way of removing land from the speculative market for housing, but also there are things like housing cooperatives and community benefit societies that can help with this. So we feel like it's our place as the voice for the community-led housing sector to raise awareness of these issues around land. And I really wanted to just sort of highlight a couple of really inspiring projects. One of them that Lindsay actually mentioned in her presentation. So the Wigtown and Bladnoch Community Initiative up in Scotland in the Dumfries area. So this is an area with very little social housing, and the private rented sector is really unaffordable. There's a high demand for family housing and accommodation for older people. But this community group took an opportunity really when the Bank of Scotland branch closed in 2007. They set up a community initiative to further the achievement of sustainable development in Wigtown. So they actually used the community right to buy to register an interest in that building and eventually purchased it in 2019. And subsequently, they've developed 2 affordable homes. They've developed a bunkhouse and a community space, and the development costs were completely grant funded. And I know that they were supported by the South of Scotland Community Housing Project, and I think Annabelle's on the call today. So I'm sure we can perhaps put her on the spot later if we've got any more questions about this initiative. But I just think it shows that the development of these rights can really help with the growth of the community-led housing sector. I am just going to skip past this video quickly because I know we're quite short on time, but I just also wanted to talk about the Atmos Totnes scheme down in Totnes in the south of England. So this is a group of residents campaigning to repurpose an old pumping station and engine house, and they've been doing this since 2007. They developed a development society in 2012, and in 2014 launched their community right to buy order, because this is also available in England. They developed a master plan to provide 99 affordable homes for local people. 62 of them were affordable and 37 were for older people. They had plans for workspace that would accommodate 60 jobs, a health and wellbeing centre, community space, flood defences. It sounded like a really great project. So their master plan was agreed by 86% in the local referendum, including the council and the owners of the site. So they had agreements with the landowners to take their plans forward, but unfortunately in 2020 the owners accepted an offer from another buyer. And I just wanted to bring this up because obviously it shows the power of the community right to buy in England, but then also shows how it's not always guaranteed, and that if the right person comes in with the right price, then the private owner can continue to sell that property to the highest bidder. So we've been doing some work on this for the last couple of weeks and months in terms of learning from Scotland and England and what we can apply for Wales. And this slide just highlights a couple of things that we've picked up. And again, it's that land value. The highest bidder can still usually come in and buy the land or asset. Groups and community groups still need capital and feasibility funding, which often isn't available in Wales. So obviously the rural housing grant up in Scotland has been crucial, I think, for the development of a number of projects. Acquisition costs are high in high value areas, but then in low value areas, running costs and income generation can be difficult. It can often be a really slow process. Although once you sort of agree on a community right to buy, sometimes you've only got 6 months to actually complete that purchase, which is often not long enough. I know in England that empty buildings sometimes aren't eligible. The building must have been used for community purposes in the past, which doesn't always fit with what the community want to do in their area. And sometimes there are poorly defined terms as well in terms of, what does a community mean? What does sustainability mean? So I think we really need to learn from Scotland and England when we're implementing something similar in Wales. And things are happening in Wales, things are moving, and I just wanted to highlight the Skyline project in the valleys, and obviously they're looking at community stewardship of land, and they're currently conducting a feasibility study that is looking at the possibility of the communities managing the landscape that surrounds their town and village. And obviously in terms of other community rights in Wales, we do still have the community asset transfer, but I don't think that we've got the right resources and support to take those things forward. So for us, we really want to continue this conversation, and we recognise that it's not just about housing, there are so many different more elements in terms of community ownership. So we can't do this alone, and we want to work with other partners and organisations across Wales to increase community rights. But I think for us, anyone that's serious about building a fairer housing system must start with the land that it sits on, essentially. So we are currently pulling together a number of recommendations to take to the Welsh Government around community land, owned land and assets in Wales. So like Scotland, we're taking a lot of learning from Scotland. We want to establish a body to stimulate innovative thinking and how land and assets are used for the community, and for it to consider integrating land rights into the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, establishing a land ownership registry and database, identifying the most appropriate method for valuing land, I think is really important. We want to see land disposal policies and local authorities for community land uses, and also to look at potential tax reforms as well in terms of land transaction tax, land value tax. Again, I'm not an economist, I'm not the experts on these things, but really do want to work in partnership to get the most out of community ownership rights in Wales. And just to finish off, just wanted to do a couple of plugs. So next week is World CLT Day on the 29th of October. So if you are a CLT out there, please create a video, create a poster, create a tweet and tag hashtag World CLT Day to celebrate the CLTs across the world. And this day is very much celebrating that this land is our land. And a couple of other plugs. There are still loads of CLH Fest sessions going on throughout the week, including a community engagement session tonight, which I think is really sort of relevant to this agenda. We've got a session with the Minister on Thursday and a session on sustaining Welsh communities in terms of language and heritage on Thursday. But that's it from me. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you for listening, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Casey. That was fantastic to see the differences between what's going on here and just so many opportunities for taking this forward. If you could, that's fantastic, and I can see everybody. Lindsay, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to start with while everybody in the chat warms up. We've got sort of 15 minutes or so for Q&A. I wanted to ask you, how the conversation got. So when communities have to demonstrate public interest, is that a kind of demonstrate it anyhow, or do they have to sort of tick a number of boxes, and who decided what those boxes were, and were communities involved in what is the public interest in Scotland?
Public interest means something different in different circumstances. So with community right to buy, they're looking to see that you're not doing something detrimental, really. So what they don't, when they're looking at public interest there, they don't want communities trying to buy land to block a development. So if there's a housing development or something like that, and the community, is thinking that we don't want the housing development because we don't like it, that would be seen to be going against the public interest. So it's down to the Scottish Government to really make a judgment call on that, and the final decision is made by the relevant minister. So they're really looking to see, is this likely to be challenged by anybody? So they have to make there's not a tick box where you can kind of add up whether you go over the bar of public interest, but they'd be taking advice internally from their own solicitors on whether they thought there is a genuine interest. But quite often we take phone calls from people, and the first thing they say is we want to block a housing development, and that is not what the community right to buy legislation is for. It has to be about something the community wants to do, a need that is identified itself.
That's interesting. And the other thing I wanted to ask was, one of the things obviously that's helped smooth the path in Scotland is that cross-party agreement. That's pretty tricky to achieve. Could you talk to us a little bit about how that was managed?
I think some of that happened
to kind of get to that stage.
Some of it happened organically because we're very lucky that we've got like really impressive communities that we work with, and they're quite inspiring in what they do. So different parties probably have different things about community ownership that interests them, whether it's about, the SNP and Labour are probably most interested in the problem with land inequality in Scotland is quite extreme, whereas the Conservatives are more interested in the entrepreneurial side of what communities are doing. So I think when community ownership first came about, everyone thought this is just a bunch of tree huggers, and they're going to be totally shambolic and they won't be able to make any decisions. And of course that hasn't played out at all. And if you look at the makeup of most community landowners in terms of their boards and their membership, it's a whole cross-section of society. So they bring people who are interested in environment, who are interested in housing, who want to create a better future for their children, people who want to kind of bring their entrepreneurial ideas for the benefit of the community as well. So in some ways, I think that's why we've got such cross-party support. But also as an organisation, we do regular briefings with politicians, and we speak to politicians from across the whole spectrum, and try to keep them informed. So there's a perception now in Scotland slightly that the whole land reform agenda is an SNP thing, but the whole movement was really started by Labour back in the days when the Scottish Parliament was set up. So it was a Labour Liberal coalition that got the whole thing moving in Scotland, and then the SNP took that on. So handy reminder to play to people's interests, I think, which coming from a policy organisation, we know all about. So just a good reminder for people here in terms of what sort of groundwork and legwork needs to be done. I've got a question here from Hugh Russell from the Wales Co-op Centre. Lindsay, I'm going to come back to you, but then I also want to bring in Annabelle Pigeon, please. So Annabelle, that's your cue. I'm going to come to you next. It's really great, obviously, to have the Scottish model to follow for us here in Wales. Where do you think things need to go next in Scotland, Lindsay? And are there different policy levers you'd like to see introduced? Yeah, so a lot of our work at the moment is preparing for the land reform bill that's going to be coming in, possibly in 2023 in Scotland. So I think, the big issue we have in Scotland at the moment is the number of estates that are being sold at the moment. So 2 years ago, I think there was 5 estates sold in the whole of Scotland. So the land market had really slowed down, which gave communities a bit more power. But now we're seeing this kind of rush to net zero. That's driving the sale of land in Scotland and pushing prices way above their economic value. So that's why there's so much interest now in public interest tests, monopoly land ownership. We had a climate change assembly in Scotland that looked to see how we could have a just transition in the country, and it identified there was a danger of a lot of land being purchased by private sector, and that a just transition could only happen if a lot of land was in community hands. And so there's a push now to slow down that sale to make it easier for purchases to be stopped and for land to come into community ownership a bit more easily than it is at the moment. So, everyone says in Scotland, land reform is a journey. We've been on it for over 20 years now, but we're definitely not anywhere near the end.
No, I think we're all on lots of journeys simultaneously. Thank you. Annabelle, how about you? Are there any different policy levers you'd like to see introduced in Scotland?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll just add, Lindsay did mention in her presentation some of the commitments that we are very enthusiastic about seeing in the recent Scottish Government Housing to 2040. So some of the policy that we are looking forward to seeing is expansion of the funding and the support for community-led housing in urban areas in Scotland. So as we heard, the community right to buy was extended more recently to urban populations, and we're looking forward to some of the research that Scottish Land Commission is working on, that we're seeing from other European partners and countries, about really extending both culture and the policy and the access to all communities in Scotland. And we heard some really brilliant examples and the long history of leadership from our rural Highlands and Highlands communities. So we're looking forward to seeing that introduced.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. We've got the next question is from Peter Williams from the Development Trust Association in Wales. And it's back to you, Lindsay, for this one. In terms of the key drivers for fundamental change and power transfer in Scotland, would you say it was community tenacity and cultural change in Welsh government, Scottish government, or was it something else?
I think that the big thing that's driven it in Scotland is just the awareness that we've got terrible inequality in land ownership, and that's been on the agenda all the way through the Scottish Parliament's existence. And if you even look at the SNP, a lot of their membership is really passionate about land reform and see it as a kind of really terrible form of inequality. So there's all these different things happening at the same time. There's widespread support for community ownership because it's been so successful. There's widespread support for land reform because people want to see a more equal kind of land ownership system in the country. So I think it's been a number of different things which have all been equally important.
Peter, can I come back to you in terms of where you see that awareness in Wales, please?
Yeah, I suppose, well, it's been the heart of our work the last 20 years, and obviously Development Trust UK-wide since the 1970s, but the history of this, I think, which is what Lindsay touched on, is more kind of, it's a deep history of this. It goes back to the beginnings of the last century, where there were examples of, in Wales, of, community ownership and selling into high-end markets in London, for the poorest communities. So it's not a new thing, this is, we've been talking about it for a long time, but it is, I think, Lindsay hit it on the head, it is about power and land and trust, actually, in terms of that transfer of power to community. So there's some big central issues here. What are the resistance to this in Wales? Because I think we need to be quite bold and say that, we really have pushed for this for a long time, but it's always been things are fine. I suppose it's been the nature of the public sector does everything, and communities are kind of, recipients of support and stewardship, and they're not actually, leading that. Whereas in Scotland, knowing the long history of that, I mean, I learned a lot from Lindsay's presentation, it was great, was there's a whole suite of things that developed over a period of time which she went through, and actually the community asset transfer is one of the small elements of that. Whereas in Wales, everybody talks about community asset development as community asset transfer, and it's just one means to an end. And I think you gave about 12 different routes into community ownership. So I think that's one thing. I think the DNA of the Scottish people is resilience. It's not about a permission culture, and patronage in a sense. It's more about actually being, empowerment and control. So I think we need to kind of look seriously at why good practice, if you can think of people like Gallery Carnarvon, started in the 1990s, owns 30 properties plus the Gallery Cultural Enterprise, to why that strategic approach to a number of assets in a village, town, community has been transferred into other communities. What's the resistance to this change happening? And also, I would say it's not just, although we're working currently with about 12 fairly largish community asset projects, but they're not always in rural areas. They're in urban areas as well. The land values are different. I think the issues are the same. There's plenty of opportunity, as you can see, of the sort of town centre kind of decline, and the amount of spaces that are empty properties above existing properties. So although it can be about new build, and we're involved in a partnership in the housing project, it can also be a multiplicity of other sort of circular economy projects, opportunities for new community enterprises.
There's a really big jigsaw then, isn't there, of things that we could start to put together, because I think what you've highlighted there, Peter, is that particularly the asset transfer thing is seen as a much bigger thing than it actually is, given the range of possibilities that are around for us. I'm just conscious of time, so I want to get to Alan's question. So Alan Shepherd from the Wales Co-op Centre is asking everybody. So I'm going to ask you to put your answers in the chat, please, because you've all got experience in something that touches on this subject. None of us are, well, some of us may be specialists, but all of us bring, and I think that's the point that Lindsay brought to the conversation really clearly, that everybody's got something to offer and everybody's got an interest in something specific. So the question is, what do we, and I think this is really well phrased actually, Alan, because it is about us doing this. It's not about somebody else doing this, it's about us doing this. What do we need to do in Wales over the next 5 years to make all of this happen, given that it isn't yet a government priority? So please, can you put your answer, somebody has to start, put your answer in the chat box, please, because I think that would really help. Now is this is part of the conversation that raises awareness, gets people thinking about the possibilities, gets me out of making closing remarks, because the closing remarks need to be yours actually and ours in terms of what we need to do next. So I'm going to keep going while you're all thinking and putting your answers in a, I can see Dave is thinking and typing hard. And I'm hoping everybody else is too. Harry, well done. You've started it off cracking. I'm looking forward to seeing a plethora of ideas and suggestions coming through, please. It's 11 o'clock, so we're going to need to wind up soon. You've still got time to put your answers in. I'm expecting things from all sorts of people to just appear now, and we'll keep the call open for a couple of minutes more. Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. I know we talk a lot about, and I talked about it last week actually at a Friends Provident conversation about devolved nations being laboratories and experiments, places where experiments happen and other parts of the country can learn from. I think the land conversation is just one of those. Wales is leading the way on a number of different things too. So I'm just going to pick up on some of these ideas and suggestions that are coming through. So get it on the agenda in a strategic sense from Harry. We need to get the Welsh Government to see it as a resource that's the foundation of everything, that it should have a strategy for and community at the heart. Jasmine is saying raising awareness of community ownership is an idea to those who haven't considered it was possible, particularly in places where there's poverty and lots of empty buildings. Thanks, Jasmine. Maggie is saying improved communications with owners of empty properties, making the case from Hugh that community access to land is fundamental to achieving other areas of the programme for government, so that linking up. The People's Land Bank is talking about distributing land to CLTs aiming to be funded by Troodos. Guy is talking about sharing and celebrating our successes. Dan about building a cross-sector coalition, housing, community energy, culture, absolutely. Raising awareness, scrapping the LDP from Tracy, linking land reform to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and be honest from Tamsin about where we are now. Much more needs to be done strategically, investment and legislation. Lydia talking about championing the Brontleys Wellbeing Park to support the health board to asset transfer and work in co-production, and empowering communities to lead in the creation of affordable homes. And from Annalie, using the Act to bring about change regarding land use. Thank you very much indeed. I think we've just gone over the time, so we need to wrap up. I know you've got another session on this evening. Casey, thank you very much for asking me to do this. I've really enjoyed it, really learnt a lot from both you and Lindsay. Diolch yn fawr to everybody else who was here. Thank you.